a slow creeping chipping away of our inner being, resulting in the inevitable death of our authentic self. This is what Dr. Shefali calls soul erosion in her book, A Radical Awakening. In the very first chapter of this book, she chooses to reflect on this phenomenon that is all too familiar to women, myself included. She calls it essentially an obliteration of our inner knowing. And in place of that inner knowing comes the ego. We develop an ego through the belief systems that tell us who we need to be in order to be a successful, lovable woman. In my case, I was raised in Mormonism, so I was taught from a very young age that I needed to get married, that was my calling in life. As young as 8, 9 years old, I was taught every week in a Mary Miss class to be a good mother, to be a good wife. I was taught domestic duties. So that was drilled into my very young brain at an early age that was where my focus needed to go. There is nothing wrong with being domesticated. I love taking care of my family, but it's not for every girl, and it's certainly not everything that I am. I am so much more than a housewife. I am so much more than a mother or a wife. I am adventurous, bold, opinionated, curious. I am artistic. There are so many things about my essence, my true, authentic essence, that have nothing to do with domesticity. To define myself and who I am essentially in my soul by roles that I fulfill or titles that I own are far too diminishing for the expansive person that I am at my core. But this is what so many little girls start being subjected to at such a young age. And so they don't even have time to develop who they essentially are and to develop their talents and skills and what they actually want out of life, what their purpose is for being put on this earth. They are told, I was told by a religion, what my purpose should be, and that was to be a wife and a mother. There were no other options. Dr. Shefali talks about how this becomes a fog for women in their lives. They live through life with this fog in their brain, completely numbing them out to who they were put on earth to be. I lived in that fog for years. If I could just keep myself busy enough, if I could just make Christmas magical for my kids, if I could make sure that my kids were at the top of their class, if I could show up at church and fulfill my callings, then I would be successful. But what that does is it keeps us in a blind denial of reality, as Dr. Shefali refers to it. She also talks about the patriarchy, which is basically a system that is set up to prop up and benefit men, and women are merely tools to that end. The church that I was raised in was definitely centered around a patriarchy. Only the males have the power of God, quite literally. So the women are accessories to that power, and they are there to prop up men in their lives. In living in this patriarchy and being raised in it, I was taught that my entire value was in being chosen by a man. Like I said, in those 9-year-old primary classes, I was taught that getting married was my worth and value. And so I had to be pleasing to a man because I had to be chosen by a man inevitably to fulfill that role. As Dr. Shefali says, we are the original lost sheep searching for our shepherds who, we are told, are either God, our Father, or our future husband. As a small child, I was taught to give deference to Heavenly Father. And then once I turned 8 or 9, I also had to give deference to Heavenly Father and to my male priesthood leaders and to the male prophet of the church. But inevitably, I was looking for a male to come and choose me and make me a wife and a mother, therefore fulfilling the measure of my creation. So how do we break out of the patriarchy, and how do we break out of this fog of delusion? Dr. Shefali says that becoming a bold woman is our path to salvation. How do we become a bold woman? That's a lot easier said than done. She says we need to start talking about our shadow parts, or the things about us that we try to hide from other people, and share them with other women. She also talks about hitting rock bottom, how rock bottom can be a catalyst for real change for a feminine. After my 20-plus year marriage failed, I still lived in a fog of delusion and denial once I was a single woman, because now I was out here hustling and trying to make the divorce amenable for the kids, trying to make it easier for everybody, trying to still make Christmases magical, trying to go to work now because I wasn't in the home anymore. I was out working, trying to be everything to everybody because I was still identifying and counting on that definition of whether to be who I was. I was still in a fog of delusion. I was also out in the dating world and I was looking at men to choose me. My self-esteem and identity was still wrapped around a man choosing me. I had not broken the fog yet of delusion that I am my own person with or without another person choosing me, especially a man, that I have my own inner worth and value and distinctions that make me me. But I was still out there dating, and I got into a really bad relationship where I was mistreated and abused. That was my rock bottom, because then I realized, depending on a man to choose you, this is the risk of that. This is the consequences of that. You can bring in an abusive man. You can bring in a man who can do a lot of emotional harm. I need to get right with me. That was my rock bottom moment. As she says, the reason why rock bottom hurts so much is because our ego's facade has cracked under pressure and we don't have that identity anymore. I didn't have the identity of being a woman that men chose, or this amazing mother to my kids and be this badass woman that had it all. That was just a title of ego. I had to get really down to the brass tacks and strip all that away and get to who I was essentially as a feminine. And I did it on apps like this. I started speaking out. I started making videos on the experience of being with a toxic man and what that did to me. I started to talk on this app and other apps about my awakening and about how I found myself again. I chronicled that process and I got a lot of feedback, and I made a lot of connections with other women that were going through the same thing. And I started to create, and I started to find my voice and find myself through sharing my story. This is what Dr. Shefali says that we need to do. We need to share our story with other women and with the world. She says self-love blossoms when we claim our experiences through our expression and our actions. Each time we honor our feelings and inner process, we declare self-love. It was only when I went within and I declared that I was no longer going to be defined by a man choosing me. I was no longer going to be defined by the roles that I played, but I was going to get clear on who I was and accept and love all the parts of me, even the parts of me that can be brash and outspoken and that had been given titles and labels of disparity and shade in the past, because men will love to call you crazy or too much or unhinged if you are an outspoken woman. That is, again, part of the patriarchy. Once I just didn't care anymore what people thought, and I was sharing and I was creating and I was operating from that authentic place of who I am, I cultivated the most self-love, and I got in touch with that inner voice and that person that has been stifled for so long. I got out of that soul erosion and that obliteration of the inner knowing, and I again got in touch with my truest self. And as Dr. Shefali says, this is the very first step on your path to a radical awakening.